The call came unexpectedly, as always, in the middle of the night. No preliminary instructions or explanations. This is standard practice when it comes to a red-level mission. My phone buzzed briefly and strictly, a coded phrase signaling an emergency muster. That never boded well. I quickly donned my uniform, checked my personal weapon and gear, and made sure everything was in perfect order. In these matters, no detail can be overlooked. Within 20 minutes, I was already seated in the helicopter, stealing glances at the grim faces of my fellow soldiers, illuminated by a dim red light. We'd worked together for years, been through countless ordeals, and understood one another without words. During the flight, information trickled in fragments, like a slowly acting poison, gradually revealing the scale of the impending trouble. We were heading north in Alaska, toward an operational oil platform that had sent out strange distress signals a few hours earlier. These signals were accompanied by powerful magnetic interference that rendered any attempt at establishing reliable communication futile. Satellites had detected an anomaly, the details of which were strictly classified. They didn't explain why, instead of sending rescuers, a special forces combat team was being dispatched. But such a decision always meant one thing: the situation was far worse than it appeared. I stared out of the window as the city lights quickly gave way to the endless dark void of Alaska. The cold could be felt even through my insulated gear. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the chill, but from an instinctive sense of dread, what we in the military call a sixth sense. I'd grown to trust that feeling. It rarely failed. When the helicopter made a sharp turn to the north, we were engulfed in complete darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of navigation lights. Below lay nothing but an endless void bathed in the dead light of the moon. The wind grew stronger, pushing the helicopter as if warning us against continuing our course. Finally, a silhouette emerged from the darkness, a black mass looming over the icy ocean. Even from above, it was clear something was amiss. The platform was devoid of lighting, and its metal structures looked lifeless and dead, like a giant skeleton cast ashore by ancient waves. I instinctively checked my rifle to ensure a round was chambered. My comrades did the same. The familiar, reassuring click echoed in the silence. As the helicopter began its descent, I could feel the tension gripping my muscles. We all understood. Unknown dangers awaited us, perhaps the worst we had ever encountered. When the landing gear touched the deck and I was the first to leap onto the frozen metal, an oppressive silence overwhelmed me. There were no sounds except the howling wind and the creaking of metal. We had arrived. Now began the most harrowing part, facing whatever awaited us in the darkness of the abandoned platform. We quickly surveyed our surroundings and cautiously began to circle the platform. The metal walls were coated with a layer of ice, and the weak lighting barely filtered through grimy windows and rusted structures. Soon, my eye caught brown stains on the floor. Blood. No bodies had been found yet, but the blood spoke volumes. Something terrible had occurred here. It was evident that this wasn't just an oil rig. In the corners of the deck and in certain compartments were anti-aircraft guns and machine gun nests. This was a genuine military base, meticulously disguised as a civilian facility. All the weapons looked freshly used, as if a fierce battle had taken place not long ago. Room by room, our inspection led us to a locked cabin. When we breached the door, we found a man in a white lab coat inside. His face was pale, covered in sweat and grime, and his eyes darted around in terror. He trembled and kept muttering about monsters, about something that came from below. from him, we learned that he was one of the scientists working on this platform. He explained that in the central block, there was a shaft leading deep down into an underwater cavern where a secret laboratory was hidden. The government was conducting experiments there, the nature of which he was even afraid to speak aloud. Now it was clear why the platform was so heavily fortified. The scientist begged us not to descend, insisting that only death awaited below. But when I relayed the information to command, the response was unequivocal. Immediately inspect the facility and report on the situation down below. Soon after we received the order, communication suddenly went dead, as if something had deliberately jammed our signal. We decided to continue examining the platform without descending to better understand the scale of what had happened. We left the scientist in the cabin with a few rations and some water. I could see that fear had literally paralyzed him, and something told me that his words were not merely panic-induced fantasies. As we moved further down the corridors, we noticed even more signs of a struggle. Walls riddled with bullet holes, doors bent as if someone had tried to force them open from the inside. In one room, we finally found the first bodies. There were 3 guards armed to the teeth, but neither their weapons nor their body armor had saved them. Their bodies were savagely mutilated, as if by a force of immense strength. I looked at my men and saw a silent understanding on their faces. This was no ordinary operation. Something truly horrifying awaited us here, and we were only beginning to grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe. After a thorough inspection, we decided to head toward the entrance of the central shaft, located in the main building of the platform. It turned out to be an elevator, clearly designed for a deep descent below the ocean's surface. When the heavy doors closed, the elevator began its slow descent, as if reluctantly plunging into darkness. The minutes dragged on painfully, as though the shaft led to the very heart of the planet. Finally, after what seemed like an endless descent, the doors creaked open to reveal a corridor of an underwater complex. At last, we found ourselves in the underwater section of the platform. Before us stretched a long corridor lit by dim, flickering lamps. The metallic walls were covered with a strange slime resembling mold, glowing faintly green. The air was thick, almost suffocating. As we inspected the rooms along the corridor, we quickly realized that they were laboratories and research areas. Chaos reigned inside. Scattered documents, shattered test tubes, broken equipment. The floors and walls were splattered with blood, and the bodies of scientists in lab coats lay scattered on the ground. Their bodies had been brutally torn apart, as if attacked by a massive beast. The marks on the floor were reminiscent of those we'd seen above, only more distinct and bloodier. It was clear that the force that had killed these people was real and ruthless. We were shocked and horrified, wondering what kind of creature could be behind this. We decided not to linger and continued our inspection. Further down the corridor, we noticed that the walls were gradually becoming covered with strange symbols and markings, scrawled in a black substance that looked like soot or ash. The symbols appeared foreign, unrelated to any known language. Soon the corridor widened and we emerged into a vast hall dominated by a gigantic black monolith. It looked utterly alien. Its perfectly smooth surface, etched with strange runes, pulsed softly while emitting a pale, unnatural glow. Approaching it, we saw several more bodies of workers lying around the monolith. Their faces were twisted in absolute terror, their eyes staring blankly. No signs of physical violence were evident on these bodies either. Thomas carefully examined the dead, and with growing alarm confirmed that their deaths defied any rational explanation. It was as if their hearts had simply stopped, killed by merely beholding that ghastly object. We stood before the monolith, and I felt its presence as if it were a living, malevolent entity. Drawing closer, I sensed an inexplicable pressure in my head, as if an unseen force were trying to penetrate my mind. The longer I stared at the mysterious runes on the black surface, the more it seemed to move and breathe, as if an ancient, slumbering monster was gradually awakening. My comrades were equally tense. Alex nervously checked his weapon, his expression confused and anxious. Thomas was growing pale, wiping sweat from his brow and breathing heavily, as if struggling against a rising panic. Mason, usually calm and confident, stood with every muscle tensed, as if expecting an attack from every shadow. Then, suddenly, a low hum emerged from the monolith. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but gradually grew until it filled the entire space around us. The air started vibrating noticeably, and the object's surface seemed to come alive, now bathed in a bluish glow. The hum built into a painful resonance that echoed in my chest and head. At that moment, an invisible force struck us with tremendous power, throwing me to my knees. I gripped my weapon so tightly I nearly dropped it. Though unseen, the magnetic wave hit like a physical blow. I felt disoriented, my head ringing, my body refusing to obey. With difficulty, I glanced at my fellow fighters. Their faces mirrored the same horror and shock I felt. It was clear we had encountered something utterly inexplicable. After several agonizing seconds, I rose and signaled for a retreat. Each step was a struggle, but staying near the monolith was far too dangerous. On our way back, we rechecked the laboratories and research rooms, hoping to find anything that could explain the catastrophe. Yet all we found were traces of panic and devastation. As we approached the elevator, a surge of fear hit me. What if the mechanism had failed? To my relief, the elevator was mechanical, independent of electronics. The doors creaked open slowly, and we stepped inside. The ascent was agonizingly slow, filled with tense silence and the constant anticipation of another blow, which fortunately never came. When we finally emerged onto the platform surface, the situation became even clearer. The deck was battered by an icy wind that pierced to the bone, and the air crackled with static tension. After checking our equipment, I realized that all communication was down. Everything was drowned out by a powerful magnetic storm that wrapped the platform in an invisible cocoon of interference. Then, the helicopter pilots rushed out to meet us, and from their anxious faces I immediately knew the news was bad. They reported that the navigation and communication equipment had completely failed, and that getting off the platform was now impossible. Hearing this, I realized in horror that we were trapped, completely cut off from the outside world. It became clear that we were only experiencing the first symptoms of the nightmare that lay ahead. For the first time in many years of service, I was overwhelmed by a feeling of utter helplessness. I frantically tried to decide what to do next. We chose to fortify ourselves in the platform's bridge, a small but well-protected structure equipped with a machine gun nest and surrounded by sandbags. With no communication to the outside world and the helicopter out of commission, our only option was to take up a defensive position and wait for dawn, hoping that daylight might bring a solution. While we were deliberating our next move, I noticed something strange about Mason. He looked unnaturally pale, was breathing heavily, and clutched his head as if in severe pain. I approached him and asked what was wrong, but he only mumbled incoherently about shadows moving inside his head. His eyes darted around with panic and madness. Soon Mason completely lost control. He slumped into a corner of the room, huddled there, drenched in cold sweat, his eyes burning with an unhealthy glimmer. He muttered about monsters and insisted that this place would never let us go. Deciding not to take any risks, we confiscated his weapon and ordered Thomas to administer first aid. Thomas tried to calm Mason, giving him a sedative and some water, but the soldier remained in a delirious state, unresponsive to anything around him. Gradually, dawn began to break. The darkness receded, giving way to the gray light of a northern morning. The tension eased slightly, and I hoped that the new day might bring even a modicum of relief. At that moment, one of the pilots decided to check the helicopter's equipment once more and stepped outside. Barely a few minutes later, we heard a desperate cry filled with pain and terror. Grabbing our weapons, we rushed out and were met by a horrifying sight. A pilot lay on the deck, and looming over him was an enormous creature. It resembled a wolf, only much larger, with long claws and a massive, muscular, almost human-like build. Its body was covered in thick, filthy fur, and its eyes burned red in the darkness. The creature raised its head and locked eyes with us before disappearing into the shadows between the structures. Rushing over to the pilot, we realized there was nothing we could do for him. His body had been torn apart with horrifying force, his face frozen in the mask of final, pre-death terror. For a moment, my mind went numb with shock. We had not been prepared for such situations. We were special forces, accustomed to fighting flesh and blood enemies, not monsters born of nightmares. It became clear to me that this very creature was responsible for every death we had encountered on the platform. There was nowhere to retreat. We were trapped, and all we could do was fight. I quickly made a decision. We had to do something that none of us would ever have considered under any other circumstances. We took the fallen pilot's body and carefully dragged it closer to the bridge, positioning it in front of the machine gun nest. The plan was simple and brutal: lure the creature in and destroy it under a barrage of machine gun fire. We took cover behind sandbags and other fortifications, aiming our weapons into the darkness. The cold cut through us, the dawn was grim, and the darkness receded only reluctantly. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity as we waited for the monster's return, ready to confront the nightmare head-on. We hunkered down near the bridge, double-checking our weapons and trying to quell the rising anxiety. The cold was seeping in relentlessly, but it now seemed a trivial nuisance compared to the threat lurking outside. I ordered everyone to switch to tracer rounds, hoping that the light of our fire would either repel or destroy the creature. None of us had ever faced such a threat before, and every idea seemed worth trying. Time crawled by. We waited, peering into the darkness, squinting into the snowy haze lit by the first rays of dawn. Around us there was absolute silence, broken only by the howling wind and our own breathing. The cold penetrated every layer, our muscles tensed from the strain, and our extremities began to numb. Then I caught a faint rustle, followed by the distinct crunch of snow. I cautiously peered from behind the sandbags and saw it, a creature slowly moving across the roof of a nearby building. Its enormous shadow stood out starkly against the white snow falling in large flakes. The beast was enormous, reminiscent of a massive wolf, yet it moved bipedally, hunched over and balancing like a human. Its movements exuded a raw animal strength, fueled by anger and hunger. The creature stopped and abruptly lifted its head, inhaling deeply through wide nostrils as if catching the scent of blood emanating from the pilot's body lying in the open before the bridge. Slowly, it crept to the edge of the roof, and then, with a deep growl, leaped powerfully down. I watched as its muscular body hit the ground, kicking up a cloud of snow and icy dust. The beast paused, scanning its surroundings and sniffing the air. I scrutinized it further. A powerful frame covered in matted gray-black fur, long limbs ending in claws that gleamed in the moonlight, and a large head that was wolf-like yet disturbingly human in its features. It approached the pilot's body, dropped to all fours, and began greedily tearing at it, emitting a grotesque mix of growls and wet crunching sounds. Suppressing a wave of nausea, I signaled for everyone to get ready. We could hear our hearts pounding and our weapons clicked quietly, poised for action. We waited for my command. I needed to be sure the monster was so engrossed in its gruesome feast that it would let down its guard even for a second. At last, the creature fully focused on its victim and shifted its body slightly toward us. That was our chance. I gave the order, and dozens of tracer rounds exploded in the darkness. Flashes of fire and light erupted from all sides, engulfing the creature in an instant. It shuddered, but didn't even have time to turn around. The machine gun's burst literally tore its head to pieces. Mason kept up a relentless barrage, firing round after round until the beast's body collapsed, consumed by flames. The tracer-induced fire spread rapidly, devouring its fur and flesh. When the shooting finally subsided, I cautiously rose and moved closer. The remnants of the creature lay on the snow, mutilated, charred, and emitting a nauseating stench of burnt flesh and fur. Despite our victory, my fear lingered. Deep in my mind, a thought gnawed. What if it wasn't the only one? After dragging the bodies away from the bridge, we re-barricaded ourselves and awaited rescue. A blizzard was intensifying, and the cold was seeping in despite all our defenses. I understood that while the battle was over, the war had only just begun. We remained holed up in the fortified bridge, trying desperately to re-establish contact with the outside world. But every attempt failed. The radio was silent. Satellite communication was down, as if we had been trapped in a dead-end snare set by nature itself, and something far more terrifying. Half a day had passed, our food and water supplies were dwindling, and I realized that waiting for help was now futile. A powerful Arctic storm raged outside, and it was unlikely anyone would dare launch a rescue in such weather. Matters were further complicated by Mason's deteriorating condition. His health was rapidly declining, bouts of delirium and hallucinations growing worse, and Thomas couldn't explain what was happening. Mason flailed in a half-delirious state, drenched in cold sweat, muttering and shouting incoherently. I could see that his condition was starting to unsettle the other soldiers. Staying here without supplies was becoming impossible, so I decided to venture out in search of provisions. Leaving a couple of men behind to guard the bridge and keep an eye on Mason, I set out with the team. As soon as we opened the door, a powerful gust of icy wind hit us. The blizzard intensified, snow lashing our faces and reducing visibility to just a few meters. Below, the ocean raged, waves crashing thunderously against the platform's metal supports, imparting a sense of complete isolation and hopelessness. Struggling to maintain our balance in the face of the wind's assault, we headed toward a neighboring section of the platform. One of the soldiers recalled that he'd seen a mess hall when we first scouted the area. We needed to get there and stock up on food. I knew the bridge was the best place for defense and communication, so that's where we had to bring all our supplies. Wading through the blizzard, I felt the cold seep through my clothes and body armor, causing my muscles to cramp. My face numbed from the icy wind, and every step was a struggle, as if the platform itself refused to let us go. Yet, fighting against the elements, we eventually reached the building and quickly went inside. Inside, it was dark and quiet. Only the wind howling outside broke the silence. Turning on our flashlights, we cautiously advanced, examining every room. Soon we discovered the mess hall, a spacious room with rows of tables and a kitchen area cluttered with cans, MREs, and bottles of water. We quickly began packing the supplies into large bags and backpacks. Just as we finished loading up, a strange noise came from above. A sound resembling cautious crawling emanating from the ventilation ducts. We froze, alert. Each of us quickly assumed a defensive position, our weapons at the ready. We waited tensely to see what would happen next. The ventilation cover lifted slightly and we braced ourselves to open fire. But in the next moment, a human head emerged. It was a man with a frightened, haggard face, covered in grime and abrasions. We exhaled in relief, realizing he wasn't an enemy. Helping him out cautiously, we learned his name was Joe, and he was a technician who worked on the platform. Joe trembled as he spoke rapidly, his eyes filled with genuine terror. He explained that something unthinkable had happened here. A few days ago, the platform descended into a true nightmare. People began disappearing one by one. Then these monsters appeared, creatures resembling the one we had just eliminated. They attacked suddenly, dragging people into the darkness from which none returned. He couldn't understand where these creatures came from until he saw one of the scientists, one who regularly descended, suddenly begin transforming into a monster. That was when everything fell into place. Amid the chaos, he managed to crawl into the ventilation system and hide, waiting for help. Joe's words sent a chill down my spine, reminding me of Mason, who now lay in our bridge. The fear for my comrade and concern for the rest of the team snapped me back to reality. I quickly gathered the fighters and ordered them to move back, immediately, before it was too late. We moved hurriedly toward the exit of the building, trying to deliver the provisions we'd found, and our new ally, back to the bridge as quickly as possible. Joe's words about monsters, former scientists, and transformations kept echoing in my head. I did my best to suppress the growing anxiety, silently repeating that soon we'd be safe in the fortified bridge, where we could catch our breath and figure out our next move. Suddenly, out of the darkness, right from the ventilation shaft above us, something huge and swift burst forth. With a loud roar, the creature pounced on one of our fighters, knocking him to the ground. His rifle flew from his hands and clattered away. I watched in horror as the creature's massive claws slashed along the soldier's body armor, leaving deep, bloody gashes. The rest of us immediately opened fire. The tracer rounds briefly illuminated the monstrous figure, a twisted blend of man and wolf with wild, furious eyes blazing with rage. I dropped to one knee, took careful aim, and laid down a long burst directly into the creature's side, watching as it flinched from the impacts and howled in pain. With unexpected agility, the beast spun around, knocked over a table, and then vanished instantly into the dark corridor. We ceased our fire and rushed to the wounded soldier, who was gasping for breath and clutching the wounds on his chest. Joe helped us lift him, trying to reassure and convince us that safety was just around the corner. The journey outside proved to be a new trial. The blizzard had intensified, reducing visibility nearly to zero. The biting, cold, and fierce wind seemed intent on snatching the weapons and supply bags from our hands. The wind howled so violently that every step became a tremendous effort. Our injured fighter was nearly unconscious as we carried him on our shoulders, straining every last bit of strength while trying not to dwell on what else might be waiting for us in the snowy gloom. When we finally reached the bridge, the door creaked open with difficulty. Inside, we were met by anxious stares from the remaining soldiers and by Mason, lying in a corner in an even worse state. His face was slick with sweat, The veins in his arms and neck bulged terribly, and his breathing came in short, raspy gasps. At the sight of Mason, Joe paled and shrieked in horror. He immediately declared that Mason had to be killed at once because he was already showing all the early signs of transforming into a monster. His words struck like thunder out of a clear sky. My heart froze and my head spun. I couldn't accept such a decision so easily. Mason was my comrade. We'd been through countless combat operations together, trusting each other with our lives. I hesitated, unwilling to believe Joe's words. Maybe he was mistaken, and there was still a chance to save Mason. I slowly approached him, studying his face intently. Then cautiously I lifted his eyelids and looked into his eyes. What I saw made me recoil. The pupils were bright yellow, narrow and feral. There was no longer any doubt. My heart contracted painfully at the realization of the inevitable. I ordered Thomas to help me. Together, we carefully lifted Mason and dragged him outside. Around the building's corner, away from the eyes of our other comrades, we laid him on the frozen snow. He curled up, shivering from the cold and agony. It pained me deeply to see him like this, helpless, lost. But I understood that we had no other choice. If he was truly transforming, leaving him alive would endanger every one of us. With a heavy heart, I raised my rifle and took aim at Mason's head. My finger barely reached the trigger as my hands trembled from tension and emotion. But before I could pull the trigger, Mason's body began to convulse violently. His bones creaked and shifted, his muscles spasmed, and a dense, rigid fur began to cover him. Thomas and I stood frozen in horror as we watched our comrade's body transform before our eyes into a monstrous being. His face twisted, elongating into a bestial snout. His claws tore through the skin on his fingers, and within seconds, before us stood not a man but a huge, terrifying creature. Shaking off my stupor, I immediately opened fire, but my shots were hasty and only struck the creature's arm. It leapt up abruptly, effortlessly vaulting over our position and disappearing among the buildings. Even as we fired desperate bursts, trying in vain to stop it. Inside, a tumult of conflicting emotions raged within me: anger, despair, and crushing guilt. Why didn't I shoot sooner? Why did I let this happen? Thomas stood beside me, just as shaken. We had known Mason for 5 long years, trusted him, and considered him a brother in arms. And now he had become our enemy, a monster capable of destroying us all. In the silence broken only by the howling blizzard, we turned and made our way back to the bridge. Our hearts were heavy and bitter, but we both understood. The battle was far from over. We had to survive at any cost. Back at the bridge, the other soldiers looked at us with a mix of hope and apprehension, but when they saw our faces, they froze in tense expectation. I recounted everything that had happened with Mason, his horrific transformation, and how he had slipped away from us to become a new threat. My words hung in the heavy silence, their faces reflecting a blend of terror and disbelief. Joe simply sighed wearily and, shaking his head, grimly noted that we now had one more enemy on our hands. His words cut deep, intensifying my own guilt over our hesitation. We couldn't afford to linger in despair for long. We had to restore communications immediately to call for help and escape this nightmare. Fortunately, Joe was proficient with technical equipment and began inspecting the gear in the bridge. A few minutes later, he reported that he had found a malfunction. A critical sensor had failed, and without replacing it, the communication link couldn't be re-established. We searched the bridge meticulously, hoping to find any spare parts, but to our disappointment, nothing suitable turned up. Joe speculated that the required sensor was likely stored in the spare parts warehouse in another sector of the platform. the decision was made quickly. We had to head to the warehouse and retrieve that vital component at any cost. This time, we decided to set out as a full team, except for the wounded soldier, who by then had regained a bit of consciousness. Thomas had carefully bandaged him and checked his wounds. Fortunately, his injuries weren't too severe. The fighter insisted on staying at the bridge, barricading himself while awaiting our return. We ventured out again. The blizzard raged even harder than before, the wind flinging icy needles of snow into our faces, stinging our eyes and reducing visibility to only a few meters. To reach the warehouse, we had to pass through several compartments of the platform. The first was a technical block filled with tanks and oil cleaning equipment. As we passed by enormous metal tanks, our weapons remained at the ready as we scanned every corner. The second compartment was a generator room. A heavy odor of fuel and machine oil hung in the air. Massive diesel generators stood silent and cold like dead giants locked in slumber. The atmosphere was tense. It felt as if any movement might awaken something terrible lurking in the shadows. Approaching the third compartment, the storage room, we suddenly heard a low, malicious growl. My heart immediately pounded faster. We instantly readied ourselves for combat, taking aim with our weapons. Out of the darkness, a creature leaped, a monster we'd already encountered in earlier skirmishes. This enormous being with a wolfish head, a human body, and covered in thick fur, charged at us with a savage roar. We acted in coordinated unison and with lightning speed. The lessons of previous encounters had made us more prepared. I ordered the use of tracer rounds, and our fire immediately engulfed the creature. The bright tracer bullets pierced its chest, forcing it to howl in pain and retreat. Without letting up, we intensified our fire. The machine gun bursts literally tore the beast apart as it collapsed to the floor in convulsions. The storage room was vast and crammed with boxes and shelves laden with spare parts and tools. Joe immediately began searching for the required sensor. Time was running out, and the tension escalated with every passing second. As he searched, I listened intently to every sound around us. Suddenly, I distinctly heard something moving on the roof of the warehouse. It wasn't just one creature. The sounds came simultaneously from several directions. My pulse quickened. There was no doubt there were monsters up above, and they were clearly not few. In a low but firm voice, I ordered the soldiers to be ready for an attack at any moment. Finally, after several agonizing minutes, Joe announced with relief that he had found the necessary part. Without wasting a second, we grabbed the sensor and hurried toward the exit. My heart pounded and my thoughts tangled. We all knew that every second now counted. As soon as we stepped outside the warehouse, the blizzard hit us with renewed fury. Yet we pressed on, knowing that any delay could cost our lives. However, when I turned to make sure no one was following us, I felt my blood run cold. Through the swirling snow, I saw dozens of dark silhouettes rapidly pursuing us like a pack of predators. They were the very creatures, monsters once human, that had lost all semblance of humanity and reason. I shouted for my comrades to speed up, and we took off, battling against pain, cold, and fear. The wind whipped our faces, our breathing became ragged, and our feet slipped on the icy deck of the platform. But adrenaline propelled us forward. I could feel our pursuers drawing closer. Their growls and heavy footfalls became distinctly audible, as if hellish hounds had been unleashed and were chasing our every step. Clutching my rifle so tightly that my fingers turned white, I realized we couldn't afford any mistakes now. Any delay could mean the end for all of us. We raced toward the bridge with every ounce of speed we had, our only thought being to make it in time. Glancing back, I saw dozens of monsters closing in. Their dark silhouettes through the snowy veil looked even more terrifying. Every step was an immense struggle. Our breathing faltered. Our muscles burned with tension, yet fear drove us relentlessly onward. At last we reached the fortified bridge. Alex was the first to sprint to the machine gun nest, instantly turning his weapon toward the advancing beasts. Joe burst inside, urgently shouting that he would work on restoring communications and that we must hold on at all costs. I yelled for everyone to take position, and we set up our defenses, ready to meet the monsters with a storm of gunfire. The first shots lit up the night air in bright tracer streaks. Alex's machine gun tore through the darkness with long bursts. Bullets pierced the bodies of the creatures, and the first ranks fell onto the snow, engulfed in flames. Yet the rest pressed on relentlessly, as if immune to fear or pain. The tension escalated by the second. A wave of monsters reached our defensive line, and a fierce battle ensued. I fired continuously, feeling the recoil of my rifle as I watched the beasts fall under our bullets. But soon a few were able to break through our fire. One monster, a powerful and swift brute, charged one of my men, sinking its fangs into his neck. The soldier fell, and there was nothing more anyone could do for him. My heart constricted painfully as another soldier succumbed soon after, knocked down and brutally torn apart by a werewolf-like creature. I shouted orders and kept shooting, but then one of the beasts, moving with unbelievable speed, lunged straight at me. I caught a glimpse of its face, and in its distorted bestial features, I recognized Mason. Our bodies collided with a deafening impact. My weapon was wrenched from my hands, and I was pinned to the ground. Mason, the werewolf, snarled and tried to sink his teeth into my throat. With all my strength, I forced my hands against his chest, feeling his inhuman power. I knew I wouldn't last much longer. My muscles trembled and my strength was nearly spent. But at the last moment, one of my comrades opened fire, and the creature's body convulsed from several hits. It howled and recoiled, giving me a chance to push it away. I quickly rolled over, recovered my rifle, and resumed firing, forcing the beast to retreat. When I finally looked around, I realized that only Thomas and I were still alive. The rest of our team had perished. Thomas shouted that we needed to get back to the bridge immediately. The wounded soldier we'd left behind had flung open the door, and we rushed inside, barricading ourselves at once. Outside, we heard the thunder of impacts and the vicious roars of monsters trying to break in. I felt blood oozing from a wound on my shoulder, the pain slowly piercing through the adrenaline shock. We were trapped. I began to think that all was lost when Joe suddenly bellowed that communications had been restored. Without wasting a second, I dashed to the radio and frantically called for help. This time the reply came almost immediately. A voice on the other end told us that a rescue operation was already on its way and was very close. I could hardly believe my ears when, moments later, the sound of gunfire, explosions, and a ferocious firefight erupted outside. We listened tensely, not fully understanding what was happening. After a few minutes, everything fell silent. I cautiously cracked open the door of the bridge, keeping my weapon at the ready. What I saw shook me to my core. Everywhere lay the bodies of creatures, bloodied and covered in snow, and among them dozens of Special Forces soldiers were moving about, securing the area. An officer with a determined, serious gaze approached us, scrutinizing us from head to toe. I quickly recounted every detail of what had happened. He listened intently, glanced at his watch, and then informed us that in a few minutes a new magnetic pulse was expected. A pulse that would destroy all the electronics on the platform and perhaps the platform itself. We had to evacuate immediately. Under the cover of our rescuers, we were quickly escorted to a helicopter parked nearby. As we lifted off, I exhaled in relief, watching the platform recede beneath us. What happened next, I do not know. Shortly after arriving at base, I was admitted to a hospital where I spent a long time recovering from my injuries. Later, agents from a secret service came to see me and made me sign a non-disclosure agreement about what had happened. I understood why, but the weight of that nightmare has never entirely left me. My mind is constantly haunted by unanswered questions. Who created those monsters? Why were we sent there without warning? And most importantly, how many more such secrets are hidden in the darkness of platforms like that? Now, with time past, all that remains is a bitter sense of loss, and the realization of how fragile our humanity is and how easily it can be destroyed when faced with things beyond our understanding. Story 2. I've been serving as a police officer in this small town in Oregon for many years. Locals simply call it Pine Limit, though most outsiders only know of it from an old movie that was once filmed here. I've always loved the quiet streets and the slow pace of life. In the mornings, a fog blankets the tall pines, and at night the sky is littered with countless stars. Tourists rarely visit, usually only in the summer, while the rest of the year we officers spend fixing road signs and chasing off teenagers who drink behind the local store. But beneath this apparent charm lies something that visitors fail to notice. Over the years, our archives have accumulated troubling reports. Residents disappearing, people appearing with gaps in their memory and eerie scars. My partner's name is David. He's younger than me, sometimes hot-headed, but he truly wants to help people. I, Carter, prefer to stick to a cool, rational approach. We often discuss the strange disappearance cases. On average, about 100 people vanish every year, and yet no one from outside seems to pay it any mind. It's as if people beyond our town can't believe that something horrifying might be happening here. Our precinct colleagues aren't fans of this topic either. Some think that people simply leave in search of a better life. Others believe it's the work of a criminal organization, but we have no real evidence. Most of the relatives of the missing refuse to speak up. And those few who are found can't recall where they've been. Their bodies bear strange scratches and changes, as if something had warped their appearance. David and I both feel that something unnatural is at work in our town. Something that defies ordinary logic. That was the state of our town until one fateful, unsettling night. That evening, while we were in the duty room, we received a call from Kathy. She was known for her complaints about creaky floorboards, suspicious neighbors, or strange noises at night. But this time, real terror colored her voice. She pleaded with us to come over, saying that strange sounds and voices were coming from the basement. I knew then that this was serious. David merely nodded when I glanced his way. We donned our uniforms, grabbed our weapons, and hurried out. I could not have imagined then that this call would mark the beginning of the most sinister investigation of my career. I felt an unease deep in my soul, as if a premonition warned that the familiar rhythm of our backwater town was about to shatter. And as it turned out, it wasn't wrong. When we pulled up to Kathy's house, I immediately sensed an oppressive atmosphere in the air. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds, and a sparse rain trickled down the windshield. The streets were lit by dim streetlights, and an almost deathly silence reigned. The house looked abandoned. Peeling paint, a broken step, thick bushes by the window. It suddenly occurred to me that no one had tried to fix it for years. I can't say why, but that sight only deepened my apprehension. Kathy stood on the doorstep, shivering under the rain and clutching her arms to her chest. She was clearly terrified. I remember the despair written in her eyes. She gestured for us to come in and whispered that we needed to be extremely cautious. I shuddered. even as I tried to maintain my composure. David, too, looked uneasy, but confidently stepped forward, keeping one hand on his holster. The basement was no better than the upper floors. Dusty walls, piles of boxes, old cabinets and crates. The air was stale, reeking of mold and something decayed. In the back, I noticed a low wooden door propped open by two heavy boxes. Kathy said that behind this door was a closet we must not open under any circumstances. I couldn't understand what could possibly be dangerous about ordinary furniture, but Kathy pleaded with us to trust her. Nevertheless, our duty as police compelled us to investigate everything. David, with his tactical flashlight, moved ahead first. I followed, feeling a strange chill seep under my uniform. When we pushed the boxes aside and slowly opened the door, we were met by a faint light filtering from a lamp hanging from a low ceiling. Inside stood a massive cabinet adorned with elaborate carved patterns on its doors. Despite Kathy's protests, we decided to open it. Inside, we found hundreds of dolls, ugly hybrid figures that looked like a cross between humans and wolves. Each had tiny teeth, curved claws, and on some, I noticed small patches of fur or fabric mimicking a wolf's pelt. Even more astonishing, many of the dolls bore names, the surnames of people reported missing. At that moment, a rustling sound came from behind a breach in the wall. We directed our flashlights in that direction. Out of the darkness crawled something enormous, resembling a humanoid wolf, but with ghastly canine features. Seizing the moment, the creature lunged forward, but when it saw the bright light and our weapons, it recoiled and vanished into the darkness. I felt my heart drop into my shoes. This thing was real, and its presence promised us long, lingering nightmares. After that ominous night, I felt as though I had stepped into another world. David and I returned to the station and immediately reported to our chief about the strange cabinet, the unsettling dolls, and the enormous creature that seemed straight out of a blood-soaked legend. At first, the chief refused to believe us. But once we showed him the photos of the dolls from my phone and brought Kathy in as a witness, no one could ignore what had happened. We tried to piece together the details: dolls resembling wolfmen, the creature in Kathy's basement, the recurring disappearances of residents. It all began to form a chilling picture that defied normal reality. We delved into the archives. It turned out that rumors about a dogman had circulated here for decades, though they were always dismissed as mere fabrications. Old newspapers mentioned sightings of mysterious creatures by local hunters in the surrounding forests. David even unearthed several articles about rituals and strange ceremonies performed by locals in the early 20th century. It seemed that our town harbored a multitude of secrets that no one had ever taken seriously. When we followed up with Kathy for more details, she admitted that the previous owners of the house had spoken of secret tunnels beneath the town, allegedly built during Prohibition for smuggling. Over time, these passages might have been repurposed for even darker deeds. I remember a chill running down my spine as I imagined that creature moving unimpeded through those winding underground corridors, preying on unsuspecting townsfolk. Some residents, especially the old-timers, would only shake their heads and change the subject at the mere mention of the dogman. Others even ridiculed us, saying we were chasing after a fairy tale monster instead of addressing real issues. But all of them were afraid. It was evident in their eyes, in their reluctant responses, and in their haste to end the conversation. Meanwhile, David became consumed by the case. He was convinced that the dogman was responsible for the disappearances. I tried to remain logical. What if it were a group of people dressed in animal skins? But the memory of that creature leaping from Kathy's basement would not let me rest. Whether it was a genuine monster or not, I couldn't explain it. All we could do was continue digging, hoping for any clue that might shed light on our town's grim secret. A few days later, while David and I were drawing up plans to search for the underground tunnels, men in sharp suits suddenly arrived in our town. They introduced themselves as agents from a federal special investigations unit. At the time, I couldn't understand why they'd taken an interest in our quiet backwater. But the chief ordered us to hand over all our material on the disappearances, the strange dolls, and the dog man. I was struck by how meticulously they probed for even the smallest details. It was as if mentioning a humanoid beast didn't raise the slightest skepticism with them. They acted as though they had already dealt with similar cases and were simply gathering confirmation. David even whispered to me that these men behaved as if they were hiding something and following a prearranged script. The suited agents split up around town. They were seen in the woods and on the outskirts, where clues about the missing people had once been found. They inspected basements, spoke with longtime residents, but did so quietly and separately. Their vehicles, with tinted windows, roamed the streets, their headlights piercing the night. The townspeople sighed with relief, yet no one felt truly safe. David and I tried to question the newcomers about their findings, but each time we were met with polite yet firm silence. We were told that the situation was under control and that nothing further was required from us. I felt a growing irritation and helplessness. We had been the first to confront the dog man and unravel the tangled thread of these disappearances. And now we were sidelined, as if we were mere extras on someone else's stage. David began to work in secret. He pored over old mind maps, questioned librarians about underground passages, and gathered rumors. I joined him, hoping to shed some light on who these people were and what had become of our monster. Yet everything we uncovered only deepened the mystery. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that these Federals knew not only about the dog man, but also about the dolls, the rituals, and the disappearances, as if they had already encountered such a threat. I started to suspect that the true purpose of their visit was not merely to solve the problem, but to cover it up so that no one would learn the truth. A week passed, and an eerie silence settled over town. There were no reports of any new disappearances or injuries. The night cries that some neighbors had whispered about were heard no more. The men in black seemed to have completed their mission. They gathered their equipment and left our town as suddenly as they had arrived. No one really said goodbye, and even our chief merely shrugged when I asked where they had gone. I realized that while the immediate danger might have passed, an inner emptiness remained. David and I were left with a heap of questions and unanswered suspicions. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily and quickly they had solved the problem, as if they already knew the dogman's exact weakness or possessed means far beyond what ordinary police had. I tried to be glad that the disappearances had stopped, but deep down I understood. If a creature capable of abducting people had once lived in our basement, it was unlikely to be alone. Our underground tunnels stretch for miles, disappearing into the forests and possibly connecting with other abandoned passageways. That very day, we discovered that Kathy had stopped answering her phone. Her house was locked up tight. Some neighbors claimed they'd seen her driving away in an old car just last week. Others insisted that she had not left the house at all, the windows remaining dark. I tried knocking on her door several times, but to no avail. I didn't force my way in, as I had no legal right to do so. Back at the station, things quickly reverted to normal. The chief believed the incidents were over. Yet David and I occasionally noticed strange tracks on the outskirts, as if something large and bipedal had passed by. They led toward gullies before vanishing. I venture to guess that it might be yet another dog man. But most of our colleagues refused to entertain the idea. It seemed no one wanted to remember the nightmare that had so recently gripped our town. I sat at my desk staring at an old map of the tunnels and wondered, what if these creatures are still out there, lying in wait? The men in black had done their part and left without explaining anything to us. The sense of hopelessness weighed heavily on my chest. And perhaps all of this is merely another twist in a decades-old legend, one that might resurface once more. Often at night, I hear a long, mournful howl echoing off the pine trunks. And then it feels as if the dogman is still wandering somewhere beneath our feet, in those endless underground labyrinths, preparing for another hunt.